We are finishing up our genetics unit, and today we're going to talk about autosomal and sex-linked traits. So when we talk about autosomal and sex-linked traits, we're talking about specific chromosomes that these traits are found on. And in humans, our autosomal chromosomes, auto means self. So autosomal chromosomes are chromosomes that code for every characteristic about you and me except for your gender. Those are our sex-linked traits and some of those hormones. So in humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, or 46 in total, one from mom, one from dad. 22 of those homologous pairs are the autosomal chromosomes. These code for some genetic disorders, some characteristics and traits that we talked about in class, like freckles or no freckles, and our hair color, our eye color, blood type. All that information will be found on our autosomal chromosomes, or these 22 homologous pairs. Again, one from mom, one from dad. The last pair, that 23rd pair, is our sex chromosomes. And we talked about this earlier, but they're represented as X and Y's, and it's not because they look like X and Y's, it's just what we call or refer to them as. And the Y chromosome is much shorter and smaller, has less genetic information than the X chromosomes. So our last pair are referred to as our sex chromosomes. They have some information for a few traits, hormones, and they also determine our gender. So they can be X or Y chromosomes. Remember, the Y is shorter. It only has information that pertains to male hormones. The X chromosome can contain more information, and that's why we're going to talk about some of the genetic disorders that we see most common, because they're found on this X chromosome. And so we'll talk about gender when we get to sex chromosomes, but so autosomal genetic disorders. Don't want to get too ahead of myself. Mendel's rules of inheritance also apply to humans with our autosomal genetic disorders. So not only do they apply to our characteristics or traits, they also apply to some common genetic disorders that we see in families. These genetic disorders can be dominant or recessive, so they can be caused by either allele, and we'll go through some examples. So one common genetic disorder that is found on our autosomal chromosome, so one of those 22 pairs, is cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis right now, especially with this virus that is going around, people who have this condition are probably a little more concerned than the general public and taking more precautions, because cystic fibrosis is a genetic disorder which affects your lungs, and fluid builds up. Patients who have this must go to the hospital regularly or have inhalers or ventilators handy either at home or easily accessed in hospitals. So 2 copies of the allele must be present for a person to have this disorder. So cystic fibrosis is autosomal recessive. We say autosomal because it's found on one of those 22 pairs of chromosomes, and recessive because it's recessive. You need 2 recessive alleles to express or to have the phenotype of cystic fibrosis. We refer to heterozygous individuals as a carrier. So these parents who are carriers, they may not know that they could potentially have a child with cystic fibrosis because they do not have the trait, they do not express it. And so if 2 parents who are both heterozygous have children, there is a 25% chance that their child would also have cystic fibrosis, even though they do not, but because they're carrying that recessive allele. Genetic disorders can also be autosomal, meaning they're found on one of those 22 pairs of chromosomes, and dominant. So these are uncommon. They're not as common as recessive. One example is Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease has become more common over the years, but it is tested for. The reason why it's more common is because Huntington's disease is similar symptoms to dementia, but it doesn't appear until adulthood. So patients usually don't know or realize that they have it until after the age of having children. So they could pass it on to their children because it is dominant. And they may not know until later on in life, but it is more commonly tested for now that we know it's genetic and linked in families. So sex-linked traits. These are traits that are only found on the X chromosome. So only found on the X chromosome. And the X chromosome is only part of that 23rd pair that we were looking at that determines gender. So genes on sex chromosomes, they're called sex-linked genes. That means they're carried on these X chromosomes either from mom and dad or just from mom, and we'll see why in a second. Most sex-linked disorders are recessive. Y chromosome genes in mammals are responsible for male characteristics, so they don't contain any information for other traits. They're only responsible for male hormones. X chromosome genes in mammals only affect traits. So it's only the X chromosomes that affect these sex-linked traits. So again, sex-linked traits are only on that X chromosome. So if you see here, males are XY. So they only have one X to pass down that could potentially have these inherited genes, or they could pass down the Y, making their offspring a boy. So again, these, just like all the other chromosomes during meiosis, get separated into different sperm cells, and so you have a 50-50 chance of having a boy or having a girl offspring. Females are XX into different eggs during meiosis. So sex-linked genes, again, remember they're only on the X chromosome, and as you can see here, the Y chromosome is represented a little shorter because it has less genetic information on it than the X chromosome. Females have 3 possible genotypes. Females can be homozygous dominant, and again, with sex-linked genes, because we're looking at, we use X as the letter, and then we represent the alleles as exponents, kind of like what we did with non-Mendelian traits. But they're represented as exponents. And the X, again, is for the X chromosome, the sex-linked trait. So they could be homozygous dominant, have 2 of the same alleles. They could be heterozygous, 2 different alleles, which we call a carrier. And they could also be homozygous recessive, have 2 recessive alleles, and that usually means they would have the genetic disorder if it was recessive. For homozygous or heterozygous, they would not show any symptoms of the genetic disorder. Males only have 2 possible genotypes. Now we write these 2 down, make sure you have these examples before we get into practice problems. So males can be normal, and they only have, if you notice, 1 allele because the Y chromosome does not carry any information. So no allele there, only on the X chromosome. So they can be normal, dominant, or have the genetic disorder, recessive. Males cannot be heterozygous because the Y chromosome does not carry any information. Some examples of sex-linked traits include hemophilia. That is where your body does not produce enough platelets and you cannot clot your blood as easily. Color blindness. Some people don't know, or some males and females don't know that they have this genetic disorder. It is where you usually have red and green color blindness, so you can't tell the difference between red or green. And sometimes blues are wrapped in there too. Male pattern baldness, so balding early, usually comes from your mothers. And then for males. And then eye color in fruit flies. So we talked about eye color in fruit flies. That is linked on the X chromosome, interestingly enough, not in humans. So sex-linked traits in males, again, they have the genotype XY, and all of the male sex-linked genes are expressed. Males have no second copy, so they only have one copy of an allele for the trait. So they either have it or they don't. So if we're looking at hemophilia, for example, it's a sex-linked trait and it is recessive. So a male could be normal, meaning they have the dominant allele and they do not have trouble with blood clotting. Or they are recessive and they have hemophilia. They have trouble clotting blood. Females, for the same genetic disorder, if we're looking at hemophilia, for example, they can be homozygous dominant, normal. They could be what we call carriers, where they're still normal, but they're heterozygous. They're carrying the recessive allele, so their children could potentially have it. Or they could be recessive and have the genetic disorder. Let's practice. Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a sex-linked recessive gene. So muscular dystrophy, as it's commonly called. Which of the following individuals above can pass the defective allele to their children? So it doesn't say females or males, so it's just any individual that has the recessive gene. So look at this chart. Which of these females or males can pass on the recessive allele to their children? So if you said this one, carrier, the female who is recessive, and the male, they can all pass it on to their children. With sex-linked traits, we still can use Punnett squares to figure out possibilities as well, just like we did with a normal autosomal. In the Punnett square above, so if you look here in the Punnett square, again, just like other Punnett squares we've done, this one has just an extra box, but normally it's not there. The gametes, possible gametes, for each parent still go along the side. And then we bring them together, and in the boxes it's representing potential offspring, or the probability of having offspring with those genotypes. So in the Punnett square above, what is the probability that their first child will have muscular dystrophy, so recessive? And it doesn't say that their first female child or first male child, just says first child. So we're going to look at all of these genotypes. So if they have a dominant allele and it's a female, so there's two, they will not have muscular dystrophy. So only their boys, there's a 50% chance that their child will have muscular dystrophy. In the Punnett square above, what is the probability that their first son? So this is really important because it says first son, so we're going to ignore the girls. Ignore the girls because it's just talking about the boys. So X, Y's, those are the only ones you're looking at. And what's the probability that the first son will have muscular dystrophy? There's a 100% chance. In the Punnett square above, what's the probability that their first daughter? So I will erase so you can see the daughters. What is the probability that their first daughter will have muscular dystrophy? And so if we just look at the girls this time, only the girls, if look at both possibilities, none of them will have muscular dystrophy. They will be carriers. Oh, that's what the question was asking. Sorry. So what is the probability that their first daughter will be a carrier of muscular dystrophy? 100. In the Punnett square above, what is the probability that their first daughter will be a carrier of muscular dystrophy? So it's looking at daughters in this example. So only look at XX for girls. And out of the girls, the probability that their daughter will be a carrier is 50% out of the girls, or any potential girls they could have. In the Punnett square above, what is the probability that their first son will be a carrier? So males are XY, and if you remember, they cannot be carriers. So there's a 0% chance that any male could be a carrier. They only have one copy, so they can't be heterozygous. And number 6, what is the probability that their first child, so here it doesn't specify between male or female, will be a carrier. So the only carrier is this one out of 4, so 25% chance.